Have you ever wondered what someone really thinks about your family behind closed doors? What if they'd been watching, testing, documenting everything for years? My name is Sarah Mitchell, and when my grandmother passed away, I discovered she'd been conducting the most elaborate character test I'd ever seen. For 3 years, she watched how we treated her, how we spoke to her, what we asked about when we visited. She recorded conversations. She documented who came to see her and who just called when they needed something. What happened next shocked even her own family, and changed everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the people we trust most. I grew up believing family meant everything. That's what my dad taught me before he died when I was 14. Blood is thicker than water, kiddo, he'd say. Family shows up when the world turns its back. My grandmother, Catherine Williams, was the cornerstone of our family. She lived in this beautiful old colonial house in Salem, Massachusetts, surrounded by gardens she'd tended for 40 years. Every Sunday after church, the whole family would gather at her table for dinner. Uncle Richard, my dad's older brother, would bring his wife Patricia and their twins, Madison and Tyler. My Aunt Susan would drive down from New Hampshire with her husband and their son Kevin. It looked picture perfect from the outside. The kind of family everyone envies, but after Dad died, things started changing in ways I didn't understand then. Mom and I moved from our little house across town into Grandma's guest wing. Mom was drowning in medical bills and grief, and Grandma wouldn't hear of us struggling alone. "This house is too big for just me anyway," she'd say, but I knew she was giving us a lifeline. Uncle Richard didn't like it. I could see it in his eyes during those Sunday dinners, the way he'd glance at Mom and me like we were freeloaders. Patricia would make little comments about how convenient it was that we'd landed in the main house. "Must be nice not having to worry about a mortgage," she'd say with that fake smile, but Grandma Catherine was different from the rest of them. She volunteered at the food bank every Tuesday. She read to kids at the library on Saturdays. She never bought anything expensive for herself, but she'd quietly pay for neighbors' groceries when they lost jobs or got sick. "Character isn't what you do when people are watching," she'd tell me while we weeded her tomatoes. "It's what you do when no one's looking and there's nothing in it for you." I decided to become a social worker because of her. I wanted to help people the way she helped people. Uncle Richard couldn't understand it. "You could go to business school," he'd say. "I could get you an internship at the firm. Why waste your education on a career that barely pays the bills?" But Grandma Catherine would just smile and say, "Some things are worth more than money, Richard." When I graduated college, I took a job at a nonprofit helping elderly people navigate social services. It meant long hours and a small paycheck, but I loved it. I loved helping people who reminded me of Grandma Catherine, people who'd spent their lives giving to others and suddenly found themselves alone and overwhelmed. I started visiting Grandma twice a week instead of just Sundays. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. We'd sit on her porch with sweet tea and she'd tell me stories about her childhood, about meeting Grandpa during the war, about raising 3 kids when money was tight. "Your father was the one who understood," she'd say. "He knew that happiness doesn't come from having everything. It comes from appreciating what you have." I didn't know then that she was watching all of us. Measuring, testing, keeping mental notes about who visited and why, who called to check on her health and who called to ask about her finances. The first real crack in our family foundation came when Grandma was 78. She'd been having some dizzy spells, and her doctor recommended she stop driving at night. Uncle Richard immediately called a family meeting. "She needs to stop driving altogether," he announced. "It's not safe." "But she's fine during the day," I protested. "She just needs to be careful after dark." "Sarah, you don't understand the liability issues," Patricia chimed in. "If she causes an accident, the family could lose everything." Everything. As if Grandma's independence was less important than protecting their inheritances, but Grandma Catherine listened to all of us, then quietly made her own decision. She kept driving during the day but asked me to take her to evening events. It was a reasonable compromise, but I could see Uncle Richard's frustration. "She's getting stubborn," he told Mom after dinner one night. "Someone needs to start making decisions for her." That someone, apparently, was him. Over the next few months, Uncle Richard began inserting himself into Grandma's life in ways that made me uncomfortable. He'd show up unannounced to check on things. He'd call her bank to discuss her accounts, claiming he was worried about her managing her finances. He even contacted her doctor to request medical updates. "I'm her oldest child," he'd say when anyone questioned his involvement. "Someone has to look out for her best interests." But whose interests was he really protecting? The changes were subtle. At first, small things that made me uncomfortable but seemed innocent enough to ignore. Grandma Catherine mentioned that Uncle Richard had been asking about her investment portfolio. "He thinks I should move everything to a more conservative approach," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee. Says the market's too volatile for someone my age. What do you think? I asked. She paused, her spoon clinking against the cup. I think I've been managing my own money for 60 years. I'm not ready to hand that over to anyone just yet. But the questions kept coming. Patricia started dropping hints about how big the house was getting for just one person. You must feel so isolated here, she'd say. Have you ever thought about one of those nice retirement communities? The twins, Madison and Tyler, suddenly became very interested in Grandma's antique collection. Are these pieces insured? Madison asked during one Sunday dinner, running her fingers over an antique silver tea set. Some of this stuff must be worth a fortune. I wouldn't know, Grandma replied mildly. I've never had them appraised. But I noticed how her eyes followed Madison's hands, how she seemed to memorize exactly which pieces drew the most attention. The conversations around the dinner table started shifting too. Instead of asking about Grandma's health or her volunteer work, people asked about her property taxes, her home maintenance costs, her plans for the future. Mom, you know you don't have to do everything yourself, Aunt Susan would say. We're here to help. But when Grandma asked for help hanging Christmas decorations, Aunt Susan was suddenly too busy. When she mentioned wanting to plant new roses in the spring, Kevin was working that weekend. When she asked if anyone wanted to join her for her weekly library volunteer shift, everyone had other commitments. Help, apparently, only flowed in one direction. I started noticing things during my visits that bothered me. Items seemed to shift around the house. A crystal vase that usually sat on the mantel appeared in the china cabinet. An antique clock that had been in the hallway was suddenly in the living room. Did you move this? I asked about a silver picture frame that had been on her dresser for years. Oh, Patricia thought it would look better on the side table, Grandma said casually. She's always had such good taste. Patricia was rearranging things. But why? Then I noticed the conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Uncle Richard and Patricia would be whispering intensely at the kitchen table, then fall silent when I appeared. Aunt Susan would quickly end phone calls when I walked by. Everything okay? I'd ask. Of course, they'd say with bright smiles. Just talking about work. But work conversations don't usually involve hushed tones and guilty expressions. The breaking point came in September, 3 months before Grandma died. I arrived for my usual Wednesday visit to find Uncle Richard and Patricia in the house with a woman I didn't recognize. Sarah. Patricia seemed startled to see me. I didn't know you were coming today. I come every Wednesday, I said slowly. Same time for the past 2 years. The strange woman introduced herself as a real estate agent. I was just giving your family a preliminary assessment of the property, she said. Beautiful home. Excellent location. In this market, a house like this could sell quickly. I looked at Grandma Catherine, who was sitting in her chair looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Are you thinking of selling? I asked her directly. We're just exploring options, Uncle Richard jumped in. Mom's getting older, and this place is becoming a burden. I didn't ask you, I said, surprising myself with my sharpness. Grandma, are you planning to sell your house? She looked at me with eyes that seemed suddenly very alert and very sad. No, dear. I'm not planning to sell my house. After the real estate agent left, Uncle Richard pulled me aside. You need to stop undermining us, he said quietly. We're trying to help her make practical decisions. Practical for who? I asked. For everyone, he said. This house is too much for her. She could fall down those stairs. She could forget to turn off the stove. She could have a medical emergency and no one would know for hours. His arguments sounded reasonable. Caring, even, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really about Grandma's safety. That night, I called her to check in. How are you feeling about everything? I asked. I'm fine, sweetheart, she said, but her voice sounded tired. Just observing. Observing what? Human nature, she said. It's fascinating how people reveal themselves when they think something's at stake. I didn't understand what she meant then. But I was about to find out. I started pulling back gradually. Not dramatically, not angrily, but with the quiet determination of someone who'd finally seen clearly. It wasn't a conscious decision at first. I just found myself making excuses to leave Sunday dinners early. I have work to prepare for, I'd say. Long day tomorrow. The excuses were real enough. I'd started taking on extra cases at the nonprofit, staying late to help families navigate bureaucracy, spending weekends at community outreach events. Work became my refuge, the place where I could focus on people who genuinely needed help instead of people who saw kindness as weakness. But the real reason I was pulling back was what I'd started noticing during those family gatherings. They'd begun talking about Grandma Catherine like she wasn't there. She's been forgetting things more lately, Patricia would say while Grandma was in the kitchen getting dessert. Last week she couldn't remember where she put her car keys. I found them in the refrigerator, Uncle Richard would add, shaking his head sadly. We might need to start thinking about arrangements. But when I'd arrive for my Wednesday visits, Grandma Catherine seemed sharp as ever. She'd remember details from conversations we'd had months ago. She'd ask about specific cases I was working on. She'd know exactly what was happening in the news, in the neighborhood, in our extended family. "How are you feeling, Grandma?" I'd ask, watching her carefully. "I'm feeling very clear," she'd say, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me think she was trying to tell me something important. The disconnect bothered me. Either she was having good days and bad days, or someone wasn't telling the truth about her mental state. I started keeping my own observations. Not formally, just mental notes. During our visits, I'd pay attention to her memory, her reasoning, her ability to track complex conversations. What I found was a woman who seemed not just mentally sharp, but strategically aware. She'd begun asking me questions about my work that felt like she was gathering information. "Tell me about the families you help," she'd say. "What makes some people trustworthy and others not?" "Well," I'd say, "trustworthy people are consistent. They show up when they say they will. They don't make promises they can't keep. They don't just help when it's convenient." She'd nod thoughtfully. "And untrustworthy people? They usually reveal themselves through their actions, not their words. They take more than they give. They're nice to your face but talk about you behind your back. They help only when they think they'll get something in return." "Very wise," she'd say. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately." Meanwhile, the family conversations about Grandma's future were intensifying. Uncle Richard had started bringing documents to Sunday dinners. Power of attorney forms. Information about assisted living facilities. Brochures for estate planning services. "We need to get ahead of this," he'd say. "Before she reaches a point where she can't make these decisions herself." "But she's making decisions fine now," I pointed out. "She's managing her own finances, her own healthcare, her own household." "Sarah, you don't see the whole picture," Aunt Susan said. "You're here twice a week. We're here every Sunday. We see things you don't see." But that was the thing. I was starting to see things they didn't think I saw. I saw how they'd arrive at Sunday dinners with measuring tapes, claiming they were just checking to see if Grandma needed new curtains. I saw how they'd ask casual questions about her jewelry, her antiques, her financial accounts. I saw how they'd volunteer to help with her paperwork, then spend suspicious amounts of time in her home office. I saw how they'd grown comfortable talking about her like she was already gone. "When the time comes," Patricia said during one dinner, "we'll need to think about the most efficient way to handle everything." "Handle what?" I asked. "The estate," Uncle Richard said matter-of-factly. "Mom's getting older. We need to be prepared." "Prepared for what, exactly?" "For reality," he said. "For the fact that she won't be able to live independently forever." But Grandma Catherine was living independently. She was thriving, actually. She still drove during the day, still volunteered at the food bank, still maintained her house and garden. The only thing that seemed to be declining was her family's respect for her autonomy. I started spending more time with her, but differently. Instead of just visiting, I began really listening to her stories about the past. Not the polished family narratives we'd heard at dinner tables, but the real stories about survival, about making hard choices, about figuring out who you could trust. "Your grandfather was a good judge of character," she told me one afternoon while we planted bulbs for spring flowers. "He said you could tell everything about a person by watching how they treated people who couldn't do anything for them." "What did he think about that?" I asked. "He thought most people failed the test," she said. "But the ones who passed, those were the ones worth keeping close." That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I started declining Sunday dinners, not permanently, I told myself. Just until I could figure out what was really happening. "I'm sorry, I can't make it this week," I'd say. "Work project due Monday." "You're missing a lot of family time lately," Patricia pointed out after the third Sunday I'd skipped. "I'm just busy," I said. "You know how it is." But I wasn't just busy. I was watching, learning, starting to understand that sometimes the most important conversations happen when people think you're not listening. For a few weeks, my absence from Sunday dinners seemed to make things easier for everyone. The family stopped asking awkward questions about my schedule. I stopped feeling sick to my stomach during family conversations. And Grandma Catherine seemed relieved. "It's quieter without the crowd," she said during one of our Wednesday visits. "Sometimes I can hear myself think." But the quiet didn't last long. Uncle Richard started calling me directly. "Sarah, we need to talk about your grandmother's situation." "What situation?" I asked. "She's been having some episodes," he said. "Confusion. Memory lapses. We're concerned about her living alone." "She's not living alone," I pointed out. I'm here twice a week, plus mom checks on her daily. That's not the same as professional care, he said. We found a lovely assisted living facility. She'd have her own apartment, but with medical staff available 24 hours a day. I felt a chill run down my spine. Have you discussed this with her? We've mentioned it, he said carefully. But she's resistant to change. Sometimes older people need family to help them make difficult decisions. After that conversation, I started paying closer attention to the timing of my visits. Instead of always coming on Wednesdays at 2 o'clock, I began varying my schedule. Sometimes I'd drop by Thursday mornings. Sometimes Friday evenings. Sometimes I'd bring lunch on Saturday afternoons. What I discovered was that Grandma Catherine's supposed episodes seemed to coincide perfectly with family visits. On a Tuesday morning when I stopped by unexpectedly, she was in her garden, deadheading roses with steady hands and clear eyes. She greeted me with her usual warm smile and immediately asked about a difficult case I'd mentioned the week before. How did it work out with the Johnson family? She asked. Were you able to get them the housing assistance they needed? Her memory was perfect. Her reasoning was sound. There was no confusion, no memory lapses, no signs of the deterioration Uncle Richard had described, but that Sunday, when I decided to attend dinner again, I watched something disturbing unfold. The family had gathered as usual around Grandma's dining room table. Uncle Richard had brought more paperwork. Patricia had brought brochures for 3 different assisted living facilities. Aunt Susan had brought a folder full of power of attorney documents. Mom, Uncle Richard began, we've been talking, and we think it's time to seriously consider your options. What options? Grandma asked. For your living situation, Patricia said gently. This house is so big, and you're getting older. We worry about you being here alone. I'm not alone, Grandma said. Sarah visits twice a week. Margaret comes daily. The neighbors check on me. But that's not the same as professional care, Aunt Susan said. What if you fall? What if you have a medical emergency? I have a medical alert system, Grandma pointed out. I wear the pendant every day. But Mom, Uncle Richard said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone, you've been having some memory issues lately. Last week you couldn't remember where you put your medication. I watched Grandma's face carefully. She looked confused, but not about her medication. She looked confused about the accusation. I've never misplaced my medication, she said slowly. I keep it in the same place every day. Maybe you don't remember misplacing it, Patricia said with fake sympathy. That's part of the problem. And then I saw it. The look in Grandma's eyes. Not confusion. Not memory loss. Recognition. She was recognizing what they were doing to her. They were gaslighting her. Making her question her own memory, her own competence, her own reality. The conversation continued for another hour, with various family members presenting evidence of Grandma's declining capabilities. Stories about phone calls she'd supposedly forgotten. Appointments she'd allegedly missed. Conversations she'd apparently had no memory of, but I'd been present for most of the situations they described, and their versions didn't match my memories. After dinner, I lingered while the others left. Grandma, I said quietly, are you okay? She looked at me for a long moment. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just learning things about people I thought I knew. What kind of things? I'm learning that some people see what they want to see, she said. And some people see what they're told to see. What do you mean? She walked to the window and looked out at her garden. I mean that sometimes when people want something badly enough, they'll convince themselves that taking it is actually helping. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the disconnect between the sharp, engaged woman I visited twice. A weak and the confused, declining woman my family described. I started doing research. I learned about something called elderly abuse. Not physical abuse, but psychological manipulation, financial exploitation, social isolation, gaslighting. The symptoms were all there. Family members claiming the elderly person was incompetent. Sudden changes in financial documents. Isolation from friends and activities. Manipulation of medical information, but the most insidious part was how reasonable it all sounded. How caring the family members appeared to be. How easy it was to disguise control as concerned. I realized I had a choice to make. I could continue attending Sunday dinners, watching my grandmother be slowly undermined and manipulated. Or I could trust my own observations and find a way to protect her. The next Wednesday, I arrived at Grandma's house with a different agenda. I want to ask you something, I said, and I want you to be completely honest with me. She set down her teacup and looked at me directly. All right. Do you feel like your family is trying to help you, or do you feel like they're trying to control you? For a long moment, she was quiet. Then she said, I feel like they're trying to help themselves to things that belong to me. Then why don't you stop them? She smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. Because I'm curious to see how far they'll go. And because I want to be absolutely certain about what I'm seeing before I make any permanent decisions. What kind of decisions? The kind that can't be undone, she said. That I didn't understand what she meant then. But I was about to find out. The turning point came on a cold November morning, just 6 weeks before Grandma died. I received a call at work from Patricia, her voice shaky with what sounded like genuine distress. Sarah, you need to come to the hospital immediately. Your grandmother had a fall. My heart stopped. Is she okay? What happened? She's stable, but she's confused and disoriented. The doctor thinks she might have hit her head. I drove to Massachusetts General Hospital with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The emergency room was busy, but I found the family clustered around a bed in the corner. Grandma Catherine was lying there looking small and frail under the fluorescent lights. But when she saw me, her eyes focused immediately. Sarah, she said clearly. I'm so glad you're here. How are you feeling? I asked, taking her hand. I'm fine, she said. Just embarrassed. I tripped over the garden hose and took a tumble. Mom, Uncle Richard said firmly, you've been unconscious for 20 minutes. You don't remember what happened? I remember exactly what happened, she said. I was watering the roses and I tripped. My pride is hurt more than anything else. But according to Patricia, she'd been found unconscious in her kitchen, having apparently fallen while making breakfast. According to Uncle Richard, she'd been confused and disoriented when the paramedics arrived. According to Aunt Susan, she hadn't recognized anyone for the first 15 minutes. I looked at Grandma Catherine. She looked back at me with eyes that were completely clear and alert. The doctor wants to keep her for observation, Uncle Richard said. And given what happened, I think we need to have a serious conversation about her living situation. What kind of conversation? I asked. The kind where we stop pretending she's capable of living independently, Patricia said. This could have been so much worse. But as I watched Grandma Catherine respond to the doctor's questions with perfect clarity, remembering her medical history accurately, providing details about her medications and allergies without hesitation, I began to suspect something was very wrong with this picture. The doctor pulled me aside. Your grandmother seems remarkably lucid for someone who supposedly had a significant head injury, he said. Her cognitive function appears normal. Her memory is intact. We're running some tests, but honestly, she seems fine. Then why does my family think she's confused? He looked uncomfortable. Sometimes family members see what they expect to see, especially when they're worried about an elderly relative. Or sometimes, I thought, they see what they want to see. That evening, after the family had left, I stayed with Grandma Catherine. She was scheduled to go home the next morning, but I wanted to talk to her privately. What really happened today? I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. I tripped over the garden hose, exactly like I said. But when your uncle found me, I was already getting up. I was fine. Then why did they call an ambulance? Because, she said quietly, Richard decided I must be hurt worse than I thought. He kept insisting I was confused, that I didn't remember what happened. He told the paramedics I'd been unconscious when he found me. But you weren't? I was never unconscious, she said. But the more I tried to explain what actually happened, the more concerned everyone became about my mental state. I felt a chill run through me. Grandma, are you saying they lied to the paramedics? I'm saying they told the story they wanted to be true, she said. The story that would support their conclusion that I'm no longer capable of taking care of myself. Why would they do that? She looked at me with sad, knowing eyes. Because they've already decided what's best for me. And the truth doesn't fit their narrative. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I started documenting. Not just my observations, but facts. Times, dates, specific conversations. I started taking notes on my phone immediately after every interaction with family members. I also started varying my visits to Grandma's house even more randomly. Sometimes I'd stop by at 7 in the morning. Sometimes at 9 at night. I wanted to see her when she wasn't expecting visitors, when she had no reason to put on a performance. What I found was a woman who was managing her life competently and independently. She kept meticulous records of her finances. She maintained a detailed calendar of appointments and commitments. She took her medications correctly and on schedule. She cooked her own meals, maintained her own household, and managed her own healthcare. But every Sunday, during family dinners, she would suddenly become the confused, declining woman my relatives described. At first, I thought she was getting overwhelmed by having too many people in her house. But as I watched more carefully, I realized something else was happening. She was testing them. Just like she'd been testing all of us for months, maybe years. She would make small mistakes intentionally. She'd ask a question she already knew the answer to. She'd pretend to be confused about something she'd just explained to me clearly the day before, and she was documenting their responses. I discovered this by accident one evening when I arrived unexpectedly and found her sitting at her kitchen table with a notebook, writing detailed notes about that day's family visit. Richard arrived at 2:30 p.m., she'd written. Immediately asked about my medication schedule. When I told him I'd already taken my afternoon pills, he insisted I was confused and that I'd forgotten. He opened my pill organizer and rearranged the contents, then told Patricia I was having memory issues. "Grandma," I said, "what is all this?" She looked up at me without embarrassment. "Documentation," she said. "I'm keeping track of who says what, when they say it, and what they do when they think I'm not paying attention." "Why?" "Because I'm gathering evidence," she said. "And when I have enough, I'm going to make some decisions about my future that might surprise a few people." "What kind of decisions?" She closed the notebook and looked at me with the sharpest, most focused expression I'd ever seen on her face. "The kind that will reveal everyone's true character," she said. That was the last real conversation I had with my grandmother. 3 days later, she died peacefully in her sleep, but she'd already set everything in motion. The call came at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning. Patricia, her voice heavy with tears. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. Your grandmother passed away in her sleep last night." I felt the world tilt sideways. Even though I'd known this day would come, I wasn't prepared for the finality of it. The woman who'd been my anchor, my moral compass, my closest friend in the family, was gone. "I'll be right there," I said, but Patricia stopped me. "Actually, Uncle Richard is handling everything. The funeral home, the arrangements, the paperwork. He said there's no need for you to come over today." Something about her tone made me pause. "No need for me to come over? To my grandmother's house?" "I just mean, there's nothing you need to do. Richard has everything under control." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen trying to process what had just happened. My grandmother had died, and my family was telling me not to come to her house. That I wasn't needed for the arrangements. I drove over anyway. The scene I found was shocking. Uncle Richard and Patricia were already there, along with the twins. And someone I didn't recognize. They were going through Grandma's belongings, sorting items into boxes marked keep, sell, and donate. "Sarah," Uncle Richard said when he saw me, "I didn't expect you so soon." "I wanted to be here," I said, looking around at the chaos. "What's all this?" "We're just getting a head start on organizing everything," Patricia said. "You know how much stuff she accumulated over the years. They'd been there for less than 12 hours since Grandma died, and they were already dividing up her possessions." "Shouldn't we wait for the will reading?" I asked. "The will reading is just a formality," Uncle Richard said dismissively. "We already know what's in it. Mom discussed everything with us months ago." But that's not what Grandma had told me. She'd said she was keeping her final decisions to herself until the very end. "I'd like to help," I said. "That's not necessary," Patricia said quickly. "We have everything under control." I spent the next hour watching them work through Grandma's house like professional estate sellers. They clearly knew exactly what they were looking for. The valuable antiques went into the keep pile. The sentimental items went into the donate pile. The family photos went into the sell pile. It was like watching vultures pick over a carcass. That evening, I called the funeral home directly. The arrangements had already been made, I was told. A small service, immediate family only, followed by burial next to my grandfather. "I'm immediate family," I said. "Of course," the funeral director said. "But I was told the service would be limited to Mr. Miller's children and their spouses." "What about grandchildren?" "I was specifically told no grandchildren." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. They were excluding me from my own grandmother's funeral. I called Uncle Richard immediately. "I just spoke to the funeral home. They said I'm not invited to the service." "Sarah, we thought it would be easier to keep things small," he said. "Just the immediate family." "I am immediate family." "You know what I mean," he said. "The people who were closest to her in her final years." "I saw her twice a week for the last 5 years," I said. "I was probably closer to her than anyone." "Look," he said, his voice taking on an edge, "Mom left specific instructions about how she wanted things handled. We're just following her wishes." But I knew that wasn't true. Grandma Catherine would never have wanted me excluded from her funeral. She would never have wanted her possessions divided up before her will was read. She would never have wanted her memorial service to be about limiting attendance instead of celebrating her life. The funeral was held 3 days later. I wasn't there, but I heard about it from Mom, who'd been allowed to attend as the widow of Grandma's youngest son. "It was strange," Mom told me afterward. "Very businesslike. Richard gave a speech about her legacy and her contributions to the family. But it didn't feel like they were talking about the woman I knew." How so? They talked about her like she was a collection of assets instead of a person, Mom said. Like her value was in what she left behind instead of who she was. The will reading was scheduled for the following week. I received the notice from the lawyer's office, but Uncle Richard called me the night before. I just want to prepare you, he said. Mom was very specific about her wishes. She was concerned that you might be disappointed. Disappointed about what? About the will, he said. She felt like you'd been trying to influence her in her final years. She was worried about your motivations. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. My motivations? She thought you might have been spending time with her because you expected something in return, he said. She wanted to make sure the bulk of her estate went to people who loved her unconditionally. I hung up the phone and cried for an hour. Not because I cared about the inheritance, but because they'd convinced me that my grandmother had died thinking I was just like them. That I'd been manipulating her for money. The next day, I almost didn't go to the will reading. What was the point? If Grandma Catherine had really believed I was trying to take advantage of her, then maybe I deserved to be excluded, but something stopped me. A memory of her voice saying, I'm gathering evidence. And when I have enough, I'm going to make some decisions about my future that might surprise a few people. I drove to the lawyer's office with a heavy heart, preparing myself for disappointment and humiliation. The law office was in a historic building downtown, with mahogany panels and leather-bound books that reminded me of Grandma Catherine's study. I arrived exactly on time to find the entire family already assembled in the conference room. Uncle Richard, Patricia, and the twins sat on one side of the long table. Aunt Susan and her family occupied the other side. There was one empty chair at the far end, clearly meant for me. As I sat down, I noticed the way they were all looking at me. Not with hostility, exactly, but with something like pity. Like they were watching someone who was about to receive bad news. Thank you all for coming, said Mr. Peterson, Grandma's attorney. He was an elderly man with kind eyes who'd handled her legal affairs for over 20 years. I know this is a difficult time for everyone. He opened a thick folder and pulled out several documents. Catherine Williams was very specific about her wishes. She spent considerable time over the past year updating her will and ensuring that her intentions were crystal clear. Uncle Richard shifted in his seat. She discussed most of this with us already. We understand her decisions. Mr. Peterson looked at him over his reading glasses. Did she? That's interesting, because she told me she hadn't discussed the contents of her will with anyone. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Let me begin with the reading, Mr. Peterson continued. I, Catherine and Williams, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. He read through the standard legal language, then reached the section everyone was waiting for. To my son Richard and his wife Patricia, I leave my gratitude for the Sunday dinners and family gatherings. To my daughter Susan and her family, I leave my appreciation for the holiday visits and occasional phone calls. I felt my heart sink. Those weren't bequests. Those were acknowledgments. Polite thank yous. To my grandchildren Madison, Tyler, and Kevin, I leave my hope that they will someday understand the difference between loving someone and loving what someone can give you. The room was dead quiet now. The twins were staring at their hands. And to my beloved granddaughter Sarah Mitchell, who spent countless hours with me not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Who listened to my stories, shared my interests, and treated me like a person instead of a bank account. Who showed me through her actions what unconditional love looks like. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the next words. I leave my entire estate. All property, financial assets, personal belongings, and sentimental items. Everything. The silence that followed was deafening. That's impossible, Uncle Richard said finally. There must be some mistake. I assure you, there is no mistake. Mr. Peterson said calmly. Catherine was very thorough in her planning. But she told us. Patricia began, then stopped. What did she tell you? Mr. Peterson asked. She said she was dividing everything equally among the family, Patricia whispered. When did she tell you that? Last month. During one of our Sunday visits. Mr. Peterson made a note on his pad. Interesting. Because last month, she came to my office to finalize these documents. She told me she'd been testing her family's reactions to various scenarios. He pulled out another document. She also left a letter explaining her decisions. Sarah, she asked me to read this aloud. With trembling hands, Mr. Peterson unfolded a piece of paper covered in Grandma's distinctive handwriting. My dearest family, if you're hearing this, then I've passed on and you've just learned how I chose to distribute my estate. I imagine some of you are shocked, angry, or confused. Let me explain. For the past 3 years, I've been conducting what I call a character test. I've been watching how each of you treated me, talked to me, and talked about me when you thought I wasn't listening. I've documented every visit, every conversation, every gesture of genuine care, and every instance of manipulation or self-interest. I've kept detailed records of who called to check on my health and who called to ask about my finances. I've noted who helped me with tasks I could no longer do myself, and who volunteered to help with tasks that would give them access to my personal affairs. I've watched who brought me gifts I actually wanted, and who brought me gifts that would look good in their own homes someday. I've listened to who asked about my memories and stories, and who asked about my investment portfolio and property values. The results of this test have been illuminating. Mr. Peterson paused and looked around the room. Every face was pale except mine. I felt like I was floating somewhere above my body, watching this surreal scene unfold. Richard, you visited me faithfully every Sunday for 3 years. But in your last 50 visits, you spent an average of 12 minutes asking about my health and well-being, and 43 minutes discussing my financial affairs, property maintenance, and what you called practical planning for the future. Patricia, you brought me expensive gifts I had no use for. While I mentioned repeatedly that what I really wanted was help organizing my photographs and someone to drive me to my volunteer commitments. Susan, you called me every week, which I appreciated. But I noticed that our conversations always seemed to end abruptly when I wanted to talk about my daily life, and lasted much longer when I mentioned concerns about managing my assets. Madison and Tyler, you both suddenly developed a keen interest in my antique collection and family heirlooms. You asked detailed questions about their history and value, but showed no interest in the stories behind them or their sentimental meaning. Kevin, you offered multiple times to help me organize my paperwork and streamline my finances. When I declined, you suggested I might be becoming overwhelmed by the complexity of managing my affairs. All of you, at various times, suggested that I was becoming confused, forgetful, or incapable of making my own decisions. You did this not because you observed these symptoms, but because my independent decision-making was interfering with your plans for my future. You discussed my living situation, my medical care, and my financial management as if I were already incapacitated. You made plans for my care that prioritized your convenience over my preferences. Most telling of all, you began referring to my possessions as family assets and discussing how to preserve the estate before I was even gone. In contrast, Sarah visited me twice a week for 5 years. She asked about my health, my activities, my thoughts, and my feelings. She listened to my stories without checking her phone. She brought me books I mentioned wanting to read and flowers from her own garden. She never asked about my financial affairs, my property values, or my estate planning. She never suggested that I was becoming incompetent or needed others to make decisions for me. She treated me like a person with valuable thoughts and experiences, not like a burden to be managed or an asset to be preserved. When I conducted my little tests, mentioning hypothetical scenarios about my will or my future plans, Sarah consistently responded with concern for my happiness and autonomy. The rest of you responded with concern for the practical implications for yourselves. This inheritance is not a punishment for loving me less. It's a recognition of the one person who loved me most authentically. The letter continued, but I could barely hear the words over the ringing in my ears and the sound of Patricia crying. Furthermore, Mr. Peterson continued reading, I have taken steps to ensure that this will cannot be contested on grounds of mental incompetence. I have undergone extensive cognitive testing by 3 independent physicians. I have videotaped myself explaining my decisions. I have documented every interaction that led to my conclusions. I have also taken the liberty of changing the locks on my properties and updating all my financial accounts. Sarah is the only person authorized to access my home or my assets. I hope that someday, you will understand that I made these decisions. Not out of spite, but out of love. Love for the one person who showed me what genuine care looks like, and love for all of you, hoping that this might teach you the difference between loving someone and loving what they can give you. With all my love and hopes for your future growth, Catherine Williams. The silence in the lawyer's office stretched for what felt like hours. Finally, Uncle Richard stood up so abruptly his chair nearly toppled over. This is insane, he said, his voice shaking. She was clearly manipulated. Sarah spent all that time with her, isolating her from the rest of us, poisoning her against her own family. Richard, Mr. Peterson said calmly, I have hours of video footage of Catherine explaining her decisions. She was more lucid and thoughtful than most people half her age. We'll contest this, Patricia said, wiping her eyes. There's no way this will stand up in court. You're welcome to try, Mr. Peterson replied. But I should mention that Catherine anticipated this response. She's left quite a bit of evidence documenting everyone's behavior over the past 3 years. He pulled out a thick folder. phone records showing the frequency and duration of calls from each family member. Detailed notes about every conversation and visit. Even some audio recordings, which are legal in the state as long as one party consents. She recorded us? Aunt Susan gasped. She documented everything, Mr. Peterson said. She was quite thorough. Over the next hour, the family tried various approaches. They argued that Grandma had been confused. They claimed I had manipulated her. They suggested the will was forged. They threatened legal action, but Mr. Peterson had an answer for everything. Medical records proving her mental competence. Witnesses who could testify to her clear thinking. Bank records showing that I'd never asked for or received any money from her. Documentation of every gift, every visit, every conversation. Grandma Catherine had been building an airtight case for 3 years. Eventually, they left. One by one, they filed out of the office without looking at me. Uncle Richard paused at the door. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes," I replied quietly, "it is." After they were gone, Mr. Peterson and I sat in the quiet office. "She really did love you," he said. "She talked about you constantly. Your work, your kindness, your integrity. She said you were the only one who inherited your father's character." "I can't believe she did this," I said. "I never wanted her money." "She knew that," he said. "That's exactly why she gave it to you." The weeks that followed were difficult. The family stopped speaking to me entirely. Extended relatives took sides. Old friends became uncomfortable around me. I was suddenly wealthy, but I felt more alone than ever. I inherited not just money, but Grandma's house, her car, her jewelry, her furniture, her photographs, her books. Everything that had made up her daily life was now mine to care for. The responsibility felt overwhelming at first. But slowly, I began to understand what she'd really given me. It wasn't just financial security. It was the freedom to live by my own values without compromising. It was the ability to help others without worrying about my own survival. It was the chance to honor her memory by becoming the kind of person she'd believed I could be. I used part of the inheritance to establish a foundation supporting elderly people who didn't have family advocates. I kept her house and turned part of it into a resource center for families navigating elder care. I continued my work as a social worker. But now I could take on cases that other people couldn't afford. 6 months after Grandma's death, I received an unexpected visitor. Madison, one of the twins, stood on my doorstep looking nervous and ashamed. "I wanted to apologize," she said. "And to ask you something." "What's that?" "I'm getting married next month," she said. "And I was wondering, would you be willing to tell me some of the stories about Great-Grandma Catherine? The real stories, not the ones we heard at family dinners." I invited her in, and we spent 3 hours talking about the grandmother she'd never really known. The woman who'd volunteered at soup kitchens, who'd helped neighbors through difficult times, who'd quietly paid for strangers' groceries when they were short on money. "I wish I'd known her better," Madison said as she was leaving. "I wish I'd asked the right questions." "It's not too late to ask the right questions of the people who are still here," I said. Over the following months, other family members began reaching out. Not asking for money, but asking for stories. Asking for forgiveness. Asking for a chance to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by greed and misunderstanding. Some of those conversations led to genuine reconciliation. Others remained strained and formal. But all of them were honest in ways our family interactions had never been before. Uncle Richard never apologized, never acknowledged what had happened. But he did stop fighting the will. I heard through other family members that he'd been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about his own behavior. A year after Grandma's death, I was going through some of her papers when I found one final letter, hidden in a book she'd always kept on her nightstand. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you're reading this, then everything has worked out exactly as I hoped it would. I want you to know that giving you my inheritance was the easiest decision I ever made. Not because you deserved it more than the others, but because I knew you would use it in ways that would make me proud. I also want you to know that I don't blame the others for their behavior. People become what they're trained to become. Our family trained them to measure love in terms of financial benefit. I hope that my final lesson might help them learn a different way. Use this gift to become the person you were meant to be. Help others the way you helped me. Show the world what genuine love looks like. And remember that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property. It's the example of how to live with integrity, kindness, and courage. You already possess that inheritance, my dear. Everything else is just a tool to help you share it with the world. All my love, always, Grandma Catherine." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the frame with her photograph. Then I sat in her favorite chair, now my favorite chair, and looked out at the garden we'd tended together. The roses were blooming again. The ones we'd planted that final spring, when she was teaching me about the difference between loving someone And loving what they could give you. I understood now that her final gift wasn't just financial security. It was the validation that love, when it's real, doesn't need to be earned or deserved. It simply is, and sometimes, the most profound act of love is teaching others what authentic love looks like, even when that lesson comes at a cost. Have you ever had to learn the hard way that someone's motives weren't what you thought they were? Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who surprise us the most. Share your own story in the comments below. Because we all have family dynamics that test our understanding of love and loyalty. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe for more real-life tales of family drama, unexpected revelations, and the quiet strength it takes to stand up for what's right. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't dramatic confrontation, it's simply living authentically and letting the truth speak for itself. Remember, the most valuable inheritance any of us can receive isn't money or property. It's the example of how to live with integrity, courage, and genuine love. That's a legacy worth passing on.